Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update for April 23rd, 2020. I'm Kevin Gostola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. We're going to be giving special attention to NSA whistleblower Reality Winner, who is pushing for release from prison in Fort Worth, Texas. But before we get to that, Brian has some housekeeping items.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us again this week. Just wanted to give you a friendly reminder to make sure that you're subscribed to us on YouTube. You're following us on Facebook and Twitter so that you get updates on these shows and our reporting. And if you're able to right now, please chip in a couple dollars. We're 100% reader funded. And we're also doing a special fundraiser right now to try to raise money to help journalists during the pandemic who are out of work. So if you go on over to shadowproof.com/donate, you can help us out. Even just pitching in a couple dollars can go a long way. So with that being said, let's dive into our first story here, Kevin. We have Reality Winner seeking compassionate release, but the U.S. government opposed the request. Can you tell us about the story you covered this week?
Right, and just to make sure everyone knows who we're talking about, Reality, she released a document to The Intercept back in a couple years ago at this point, and it showed what she believed to be evidence that there was. Well, sorry, 2 years ago she pled guilty. She took an agreement, but she released this document that she believes showed that there were Russian hackers that were targeting voter registration systems. And so she's serving the sentence. She took a plea agreement. She pled guilty to one count of violating the Espionage Act. This is she was the first under Trump to be targeted with an Espionage Act prosecution. So very prominent. It was one of the first prominent cases of someone leaking to the press during Donald Trump's administration. And so this is something that we've seen many prisoners pushing to be released from prison during the outbreak. But it is this gains extra prominence. More than half of her sentence has been served. She was given extraordinarily one of the longest sentences ever handed down to somebody who was responsible for a leak. And her mother, Billy Winter Davis, has said that the BOP is vindictive and cruel and unjust and unfair. They, along with the Justice Department, are opposing this request for compassionate release. She reacted to this news further, saying that as her mother, I can attest to the fact that my daughter, Reality Winner, has been hospitalized twice for pneumonia. If the court scheduled a hearing, I could actually testify to this fact. Her mother also says she would testify. She typically contracts bronchitis on an annual basis. And she would also point out that she has risk from seasonal allergies. So at this time, they requested a hearing. They asked a court in Georgia, because that's where they have to go. That's where Reality was based in Augusta. She was working a job as a contractor. She was there. And so that's where she was tried and ultimately accepted the plea agreement there. And so this federal court in the Southern District of Georgia was asked to hear her request for release. And they're trying to do this under the First Step Act, which they say gives them extra ability to push for release because there are extraordinary reasons why she should no longer be in prison. They would like home confinement, to be placed under home confinement with her family. And the judge rejected the request to expedite this, not believing there was urgency. Of course, family and supporters are saying that's not right. We need to have a hearing at this time right now so that we can get her out. There are other prominent people like Michael Avenatti and Michael Cohen who have been let out of jail either early or Avenatti hasn't actually been convicted yet, is pending trial, but is out before conviction. So they're pointing to some of these celebrity cases or well-known cases as examples of how the Bureau of Prisons could do more to protect Reality Winner. They actually kind of treat her as if she might be neurotic. If you read the opposition that was filed by the Bureau of Prisons, which I believe is cold and cruel on the part of the Justice Department, because they suggest that she is trying to have it both ways. She wants the Bureau of Prisons to protect her from the spread of the coronavirus, but at the same time, she is saying that the restrictions that have been imposed upon her are actually making her health worse. So they don't believe that could be consistent. And so I think that's rather obnoxious on the part of the Justice Department, the way that they're going about that. I think what she's saying is that she no longer can do the normal exercise routines that she does on a daily basis because of the lockdown, and that's affecting her health and affecting her mental health in particular. And so the Bureau of Prisons and the Justice Department insist that they are doing everything they can to protect prisoners, and that Reality Winner does not qualify as somebody who should be released from the facility. Or she does suffer from things like depression, and she suffered from an eating disorder, and there are histories of respiratory illnesses that should make her somebody that is considered for release early. And in the facility itself, there was some additional journalism done by The Appeal, which we've talked about on this weekly show as doing some exceptional journalism in the past weeks. And they actually highlighted what's going on in Carswell. And for people who aren't familiar with this facility, if you go back 10 years, it was known as a kind of hospital of horrors. It's kind of like a federal prison hospital. The Bureau of Prisons is emphasizing that this is a medical care facility, as if that should be some kind of a sign that if people got sick, they would be taken care of very well. But we know that prisons are not good places for people to receive treatment. In fact, for the most part, whether you're talking private or public facilities, they go above and beyond to not provide care because they want to keep costs down. And they would rather release prisoners back into their communities and have them take on healthcare costs from private insurance companies, et cetera, than provide care themselves. So there's prisoners within this facility who talk to The Appeal about what's happening, suggesting that the virus is really scary, that it's the thing that scares me is that we are 300 people in one unit, and if it does slip in, we are going to spread it like wildfire. That was one quote that came from a prisoner named Nicole. And so there's all these different examples of what's going on within the facility. There's one prisoner who was a pregnant woman who is now in critical care on a ventilator, and her baby was delivered early by C-section. That was earlier. So there's all kinds of reasons to believe that there is coronavirus in the facility and that there's reasons to be concerned about how it could impact people. There are only 2 prisoners being reported by the Bureau of Prisons, but Billy says that she is confident that the facility is not counting all of the cases, known cases. Now, we know that there are many layers to this. So you can have a facility that's undercounting, and then you can also have a facility that isn't testing people, so they don't know who has the virus. And then you can have people who are asymptomatic who have the virus. And even if they're not showing signs of being contagious, they're still spreading the virus because they're carriers. So we're confident that the 2 cases they claim only exist at the Bureau of Prisons aren't the only cases at Carswell. And obviously that would be true for several facilities throughout the United States, whether we're talking the federal or the state level. And so here at this facility, this is what's going on with Reality Winner. And she believes that since she served about half of her sentence, that she should be eligible for release at this time.
Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate your reporting on that story, and we will definitely keep an eye on Reality's situation.
There's actually one more thing that I wanted to add here separately. I just wanted you to get in because I know you have expertise on this, and thought if you might have to add anything. But before we move on from this, I did want to get in here that there is a bit of an additional prison whistleblower story that's going on at Carswell. And I have no idea if Reality has come into contact with this person or not, but there's someone named Mendy Forbes, who I mentioned in my coverage at Shadowproof, who is working, doing a little bit of I guess you call it jailhouse lawyering, was helping prisoners apply for release during this time because she recognizes it's crucial to have them proactively trying to argue for their release when they are so vulnerable. But she was put in solitary confinement because she talked to the press about what was going on in the facility and the failures of the facility to take care of people. She mentioned that there are about 250 women in her housing unit, and that there are only 120 chairs available for people, that the prisoners are sleeping 4 to a cell, less than 3 feet apart, that everyone's expected to wear the same disposable mask every day, and the phones are in pretty heavy use, but they're not seeing anyone sanitizing the phones. And so this is important. Also, Mendy's case is somewhat remarkable because she's serving a 20-year sentence, according to this Dallas radio station, for conspiring to launder money from illegal marijuana sales, but she's appealing her conviction because she was one of several cases affected by something called it was a widespread phone tapping scandal that happened at a privately operated facility in Kansas. And so she believes she has recourse to challenge her conviction and violation of her constitutional rights. So not only do you have that, but she's also using her training as a lawyer to help prisoners. And primarily in this facility, people should know it's elderly, it's pregnant women, it's people who have chronic conditions. Reality actually applied to be in this facility because of some of her own medical conditions.
Thank you. I mean, I think you did a really good job discussing that and going through some of the issues. I think it's really interesting that they are treating Reality as though she's trying to have it both ways, when in reality, the prison is the one that's trying to have it both ways by, claiming. Go ahead. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask you. I mean, doesn't it strike you as it could be both true that that they're not doing what they're supposed to protect prisoners, and the measures being put in place are making it worse?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, any reporter or even family member, but any reporter worth their salt will tell you that prisons lie as a practice. Anything that you see, particularly in a moment of crisis, whether it's a pandemic or whether it's a riot or an uprising, the things that they are putting out and that they are saying that they are doing are almost universally should be treated with skepticism and as complete falsehoods. I was just speaking to the wife of a prisoner in California earlier this week for the podcast that I do Beyond Prisons. And we went through the CDCR statement where they say, oh, we have set up hand sanitizer stations. We're cleaning the phones in between, every use, and where people are social distancing on the yard. And we went through it and discussed how every single one of those things is completely false and even impossible to happen, just by the very nature of the way prisons are built. They're congregate spaces. They're places where, by necessity, people are not only living in close quarters, but they share the dining hall, they share the bathrooms, they share the phones. And because there has been such an effort to deny simple things like phone calls, for example, to prisoners, they don't even have enough phones on a good day. So you have hundreds of people on a yard in California, for example, where the phones are, trying to get in their 15-minute phone calls lined up, all the way. And it's just a farce. The whole thing is just a farce. So I appreciate everything that you said there. And I would just encourage people to continue to take the measures that the prisons are claiming that they're taking to protect prisoners. For the most part, I think that the best way to look at those are covering their own asses for litigation, as well as trying to deter any oversight by legislatures. The last thing they want is to have representatives start to show up and demand to have tours and see the premises. And so that's why they make these statements.
And one thing I'd like to just get in here before we move on, and again, we only have a few stories this week, so we're spending more time on this at the top here. I want to say that I found out from her mother that Reality is only issued, she said she was only given one mask at the time. That may have changed. One mask or two masks. These cloth masks are supposed to last for 7 days before they are washed. And with the frequency in which you're coming into contact with people who might have the virus, it's, to be clear, the CDC says masks are not a substitute for social distancing. Mm-hmm. And I believe that, and maybe you would agree, the Bureau of Prisons is using them as a substitute for social distancing because they know that the way that their facilities are built doesn't really allow for what you would need to have prisoners do. So logistically, okay, problems with mass incarceration aside, practically you just can't because of the way these are built. You have dormitory units where people are on top of each other. And so what they're doing is trying to tell us that having people in masks makes them safer. And that just simply isn't true.
Yeah, I mean, just to take that one step further, I think that it's like security theater. You know, it's not even supposed to be a substitute for social distancing. I mean, even the cloth reusable masks, I believe the CDC is telling us that you shouldn't be reusing them. You're supposed to wash them in between every use, which in a cell is just not even possible. You don't have the supplies to do it. And it's just not realistic. They're telling people, in my view, that they're giving out masks in order to quell any concern that there might be on the outside that they're not doing anything. It's not about the efficacy of the masks. It's about the spectacle of the masks. So yeah, would you like to move on to our next story here?
Yeah. And thanks for that. Everyone should listen to Brian's Beyond Prisons podcast. It's had some important stories from people who, I think technically speaking could be classified as whistleblowers to some degree. They are speaking at risk. And if it gets back to the prisons, it might result in retaliation. So it's a good show that fits in with the theme of what we do here with Dissenter Weekly.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next story here. We have federal vaccine agency official blows whistle after Trump officials remove him. What's this story?
Well, yeah, and I just wanted to go through this one because this is a story that's been given mainstream attention. It broke in it broke yesterday on April 22nd. This is Dr. Rick Bright, and I've got Dr. Rick Bright's statement in front of me. He was fired from his position working at an agency that is probably lesser known to people, but we're all going to know it now because of how these whistleblowers come forward and get attention. He was the director of the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, or BARDA. So I'll just be calling him the BARDA whistleblower for this segment here. And he was also working for Health and Human Services as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response by the administration. And as he says, what he was working on in particular was making sure that the government was prepared for things like a pandemic. It's part of his bureaucratic work that he'd been doing all along. And I wanted to assess this because one of the things we've dealt with during our show is the partisan nature in which whistleblowers who come forward under the Trump administration, how what they're doing maybe gets exaggerated or embellished. Are they or are they not a whistleblower? Are they just carrying out some kind of partisan agenda for the Democrats? Or, not that they ever deserve retaliation, but is there something more going on here than with cases like Reality Winners or Edward Snowden's or Chelsea Manning's? Is there something, because some of these people are leaders. They do have the ability to defend themselves. They're maybe less vulnerable. So I think we need to have a more holistic kind of analysis of what they're doing. And I do believe that this person is a whistleblower. He was reassigned. And if his face value, if I look at the statement that was put forward here, he was moved to the National Institutes of Health so he could have less impact. And the reason he was reassigned, he says, is because he started to insist that the government invest billions of dollars allocated by Congress to address the COVID-19 pandemic into safe and scientifically vetted solutions and not in drugs, vaccines, and other technologies that lack scientific merit. And he says, quote, "I am speaking out because to combat this deadly virus, science, not politics or cronyism, has to lead the way." So it seems to me like someone who, bureaucratically speaking, put his neck out there and suffered great risk. He seems to have been challenging the biotech industry. He says his background has led him throughout the years to be in a position where he was ready to confront and defeat this deadly virus. This is sort of thing that he's been at the agency working to prepare for all along. But there's just been clashes with the leadership at Health and Human Services. They've criticized his proactive efforts to invest early in vaccines and supplies that are critical to saving American lives, he claims. He says he resisted efforts to fund potentially dangerous drugs promoted by those with political connections. And this is where, this relates to something that everyone has become very familiar with. Specifically, he took issue with the emphasis in doing testing and development of chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, which has become a favorite thing for Donald Trump to talk about as a panacea, something that could address this coronavirus crisis. He does not believe that there's a lot of scientific merit behind what has been, up to this point, a fairly unproven drug with great risks to people. It's only being given to hospitalized patients with confirmed COVID-19 and while under extreme supervision by physicians. And they have potentially serious risks. We've seen people die who have tried to take this drug independently on their own. So he says, sidelining me in the middle of this pandemic and placing politics and cronyism ahead of science puts lives at risk and stunts national efforts to safely and effectively address this urgent public health crisis. He's requesting that the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services investigate the way in which he was removed from his job. He says that it's wrong to rush blindly towards unproven drugs. And then he adds that he's glad that he's seeing some support in Congress. Apparently some money was put into BARDA through the third coronavirus package in order to invest in it. Of course, he's very aware that there are pressures and that some of that money may go to companies with political connections to the Trump administration, and obviously concerned that there's a lack of oversight in how that money is being spent. But I think as I look at his statement, no matter how this may be used for partisan purposes by the Democrats, that this is, in fact, a true whistleblower who deserves our support.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm glad you brought that story to us. I had not heard that until you brought it, so I appreciate it. Our next story here, I guess, is a bit of a local news story for you.
Yes.
We have leaked recordings that show the Chicago mayor undemocratically expands power. What's going on in Chicago?
All right, so where I am based, Mayor Lori Lightfoot is trying to strong-arm the city council members into granting her expanded authority to determine how hundreds of millions of federal dollars in stimulus money is spent. She wants the authority that would extend until June 30th. And I'll add as like a sidebar here that I wouldn't be stunned to learn that this was what was happening in other bigger cities throughout the country that are getting this money and want to be able to quickly put those dollars to work and not go through democracy, essentially, not go through the long drawn-out process of hearing from elected representatives what they would really like to have done with that money. Hundreds of millions of dollars, it's quite a pool of money to be able to use to address whatever is being proposed. So, for example, advocates for homeless individuals would like the city to address quote unquote, long-standing issues, end quote, through measures such as bridge housing. And Lori says that the money should only go towards, quote, costs incurred because of the COVID-19 crisis, end quote. This reminds me of how she thwarted the Chicago Teachers Union and their efforts to win funding for affordable housing when they went on strike in 2019. She's very adamant that that was not a part of the bargaining process, so they couldn't use that and request action on affordable housing under the framework of their strike. On Wednesday, emergency powers were blocked by Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa, who is a Democratic socialist in the city council. Several other progressive city council members helped him in blocking this. However, it's still likely to pass. There's going to be a vote on Friday, and that is expected to happen, that it would actually make it through, that she would have the votes to overcome. This is in the tradition of Rahm Emanuel and how he ran the city of Chicago. And so with that as a backdrop, we have these leaked recordings from ProPublica, an outlet that I've been singing the praises of on this show because they've had some incredible reporting on the coronavirus crisis. And these recordings reflect how dismissive and nasty Lori has been toward democratically elected city council members who are trying to meet the needs of their residents. City council member Andre Vasquez said, "I've got people ready to rent strike, so I need to figure out what's going on." And he was seeking some information about what might be done to address their needs. And Lightfoot briefly paused, and then she took a minute to tell Vasquez that that there just wasn't any way he could get this information. I think he wanted to get some information from the state in particular to figure out what proposals were being considered by the state as ways to help people. And she said something about our biggest priority, obviously, is making sure we've got hospital beds, and rent assistance is something that is a conversation that's going on. But I just can't commit to documenting every single conversation we're having with the state on a range of issues. That's not feasible. And candidly, given all the things we're doing, we've got people who've been working literally 30 days straight. I don't think that's a good use of our time. So she just flat out said, no, we're not going to do anything to make sure elected representatives have more information that they could pass on to their constituents. And then that was that. And it's been a way that she's handled all kinds of questions put to her by aldermen, dismissing them and saying that, you know, they should just come back later or go to the website. Like the City of Chicago website has that information. Tell people to go to the City of Chicago's website. There's a grassroots coalition called the Right to Recovery that's trying to prioritize the health of communities. That includes their access to water and power. But this wider city council so far has mostly been disregarding these requests to address human needs. And like I said, it seems like they're probably going to grant Lightfoot these vast powers come Friday.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move on to our last segment here, our recurring segment on Julian Assange. What's the latest news we have on Julian?
Yeah, so the last thing I wanted to say here is we are continuing to pay attention to what's happening with Julian Assange, who remains in the Belmarsh prison. And we can presume that the coronavirus continues to spread within that facility as we can presume for almost any facility that's a prison right now around the world. We have not had a postponement of the hearing yet. There is a case management hearing on April 27th where we find out if the extradition hearing in May is going to be moved. There's somewhat of an indefinite extension of the stay-at-home order in the UK is what I understand. So like a lot of places, jurisdictions in the United States, the UK doesn't really know when they're going to be done dealing with this coronavirus pandemic and allow people to go back to living out in the open again. And the mortality rate, I looked at this, Brian, is actually a lot higher in the UK by comparison to the United States. It's somewhere around 13%, where the US is actually about 5 to 6%. So it's been hitting the UK much worse. And so I still don't understand why the magistrate judge, Vanessa Baretzer, has not postponed this hearing. I'll repeat that I think this is somewhat vindictive on the part of Vanessa, and it is undermining the due process rights of Julian Assange to not move this hearing to September as the defense attorneys requested. If I remember correctly, the prosecutors were agnostic on it and open to postponement. And so she just simply decided not to protect the rights of Julian. And he can meet with his attorneys, but he can only talk to them. Sorry, he can't meet with his attorneys right now. He can only do a video link when the prison agrees to make that available. It's largely a very limited amount of time that he would get to talk to his attorneys. And, meanwhile, he is under a lot of duress because he's trying to protect himself, and also he's in conditions of solitary confinement in order to protect himself. Like, a lot of the prisoners are as isolated as they can be and getting as little recreation time because of the pandemic that is unfolding. So this is something to continue to keep following closely, because he's at greater risk than he was earlier in his confinement. Back in January, he had succeeded in getting out of solitary confinement conditions. This has put him back in those conditions, and this fear is that that's just going to continue to exacerbate and cause the deterioration of his health, which is something that they had been watching closely. Had dozens of doctors say that he should be released to home confinement because of what is going on with his health, and yet the judge, Vanessa, has refused to take any sort of action to protect him. So, and then the other thing I'll add is that the Reporters Without Borders organization noted this past week that the UK slid down in the rankings as far as press freedom, and part of sliding down in those rankings was a result of the fact that this case is pushing forward. It didn't really affect the United States. It was interesting, but in the Reporters Without Borders analysis, apparently we've been jailing less journalists over the past year, so they felt like that needed to be reflected in the ranking. So we actually moved up in the ranking, even though this case was launched last year in 2019. So with Julian Assange, everyone around the world is continuing to push for his release. All of his supporters are continuing to push for his release from Belmarsh, and we'll have to stay tuned to see if there is some kind of a postponement of the extradition hearing. Otherwise, I think that there will be an uproar from journalists who cannot travel, and we'll definitely see worse coverage of it, I think we'll see that our understanding of what's happening in the case will take a hit, because we'll be reliant on 4 or 5 British media organizations, and we won't get to see 20 or 40 different organizations cover this 3-week hearing because it'll be unsafe for them to go travel and cover. But then also, they're not going to be able, they might not be able to go if the court restricts it to British journalists, and we would be at a loss, because having dozens of different people from around the world cover, I think, gives us a range of perspectives on the case that are crucial to helping us understand why this is such a globally important case that is happening.
Thank you, Kevin. I wholeheartedly agree, and I know that we'll do whatever we can to continue our coverage and continue to upstage the mainstream media as you have on the coverage of Julian Assange. Any final thoughts before we wrap today?
I would just to say thank you for everyone who made it through this program again and watched our updates. I'm grateful for everyone who shares this show on a weekly basis. If you have a link to the show, please share it with your friends, share it with your family members, share it with everyone on lockdown who maybe wants something to give them more information that is important for people to have during the crisis here. And I'm just, I'm thankful that people out there are giving our show support. And we also have a fund going at Shadowproof now to support journalists who have been intensely hit by the crisis. It's somewhat unrelated to the show, but it fits into what we're doing, our mission at Shadowproof. So if you have a couple dollars to throw our way, we're going to be able to give additional work to journalists who have maybe been laid off or having trouble getting their pitches greenlit, and so that'll be very helpful to us. And we're going to have we're matching donations up to $5,000. So we think that there's a great potential to raise a lot of money that could support journalism in this crucial time.
Thank you. I just want to add, I do think that it is germane to this show. I think that what the pandemic is doing to exacerbate the crisis in journalism is a press freedom issue, because the more journalists that are out of work, the more of these smaller local news outlets that crumble, the more media concentration we're going to see upwards. The more we're going to see journalists have to leave the industry entirely or go work on the corporate side in public relations in order to make a living. So I do think that this is a press freedom issue, and I would encourage people, again, like Kevin said, we're very appreciative of the support that we've gotten. People are already starting to chip in money for this COVID-19 freelance fund. We want to do whatever we can to keep reporters working, keep them fed, keep them housed, and at the same time, keep the public informed. So even if you could just chip in $5, it'll go a long way. We'll match it, and we'll put journalists to work. So
yeah, we're seeing that it's about 33,000 people that the New York Times was able to estimate that have come from all different outlets. I mean, no matter your differences with how any particular outlet has or has not covered certain stories or issues, we all have to show solidarity right now within this industry. And then, of course, you can expect from an outlet like Shadowproof that will have particular solidarity for the people who work independently and are going to fall through the cracks because they have always lacked institutional support. And I mentioned that there are people who are, you can think of it like the way unemployment works. There are people who apply for unemployment. There are people who get listed as jobless. But before the crisis, if you stopped looking for work, you would no longer be considered in the tally. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be reflected in the numbers of people who are said to be laid off or fired. That there are a number of people who have seen their opportunities dry up. They're not necessarily considered fired or laid off from any spot. They were never really working somewhere. They didn't have a place that provided them stable income, and they were working from they were going pitch to pitch to pitch trying to get by. And we work with a lot of journalists that are struggling, and if they don't get their pitches greenlit, then they have to ask for donations on their GoFundMe or ask for additional support to be given to them via Patreon. Mm-hmm. And some of these people have platforms. Some of them have people who follow them. They can go to their followings and they can get donations, and some do not. And what we're going to do our best to not only provide charity, but to provide solidarity and have people allow people to do meaningful work so that they can do something with their time, not just sit there and be miserable and feel like they have nothing that they can do. There's no support for them, but that they can also write stories, put together their own work so they can continue to be doing work. So after this crisis is over, when they do want to go back to these institutions, they could go back and reapply for jobs or reapply for work. Shadowproof has always been a place where people who are in between jobs can come to, and they can publish their stories with us. There are a few reporters that come to my mind who have landed in really good places, but in between jobs, they did some work for us, and we were glad that we were a stopping ground for them.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, with that being said, just wanted to thank everyone again for joining us for this edition of the Dissenter Weekly. Like I said at the beginning of the show, please subscribe on YouTube and like us on Facebook and Twitter so you can keep up with what we're doing. And again, if you're able to, go to shadowproof.com/donate and help us raise money for freelance reporters right now. So thank you, everybody, again for listening, and we will talk to you next week. Please stay safe.